Hello, and welcome to the Write Club podcast, where we take you behind the pages and into the fascinating world of writing. I'm Mary, and this is Beth, and we are part of the team at Writing Magazine and Writers Online. Hi, Beth, how are you?
Yeah, I'm really good, thank you. Really excited about our guest this week. She's a best-selling author of The Girl from Donegal and The Lighthouse Secret, amongst others. It's Carmel Harrington. Carmel's books have sold over 500,000 copies in the UK and Ireland and have been translated into several languages. Hiya, Carmel. Thanks so much for joining us today. Where are we speaking to you from today?
Well, I'm from Wexford in Ireland. It's in the southeast of Ireland, and I live in a very rural part of Wexford. I'm literally the middle of nowhere. Kind of, there's a town on either side of me, 9 miles away, so it's a bit of a trek. But I am very close to the beach, so it's kind of a coastal area. Very sleepy village. Think, thatched cottages, tractors rumbling by. That's about the only noise I hear on the road. So it's really idyllic actually. I love it here. And it's
Yes.
where I grew up. It's my mum and dad live a few minutes down the road. So while I kind of disappeared for many years when I left school and traveled everywhere, I came back home again and have settled here. So I love it.
Oh, it sounds amazing.
It sounds lovely.
Curracloe Beach is my local beach, and that's where Saving Private Ryan was filmed. So
Oh,
we had a
wow.
very exciting time whereby all, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg and everyone took over the village hall, like where all the birthday parties are set, became like a studio for these Hollywood stars. Just very exciting for a while. And more recently, Brooklyn, the Colm to Bean adaptation of Brooklyn. Well,
Oh,
that was
yeah.
filmed in Wexford in Enniscorthy, but a lot of the scenes are on Carclough Beach. There's my claim to fame. Not that I was
Oh,
involved in either of those, but it was quite nice.
wow.
My neighborhood.
Oh, lovely. Are you in your writing space now?
I am. I'm very lucky actually that I have my own writing room. I have a dedicated space just for me. That's not always been the case. I've written on my knee at the kitchen table and in the corner of the sitting room, but now we've changed one of the spare bedrooms into a writing space. So I have this lovely mural behind me. I love trees. I'm very much my happy place is being anywhere where there are trees about. So I got this gorgeous mural wallpaper of trees, which is behind me, and in front of me is a floor to ceiling bookshelf, and it is just my books in it, which is a little bit egotistical, but it's also motivational. So when I'm kind of struggling at my desk, I can see everything that I have done, and that helps me kind of think about what I need to do to move forward. It's a
Oh,
nice
and
space.
how does a typical writing day look for you? Are you writing every day, or does it
Yeah, I
depend?
kind of do try to when I'm in the kind of creating side of writing, when I'm writing a first draft, I have to kind of stay in the story. So I find it works for me to write every day, even if it's only for an hour on a Saturday and a Sunday, which is like, I suppose, the typical downtime really. But by doing even a couple of hundred words on those 2 days, it means that on Monday I have a more productive day. If I stop for a few days, it takes me a while to kind of get back into it.
Yeah.
But my schedule, I've worked hard to get it to this, but I have been, as you said, now my 13th book is just about to be published, and it's taken me those 14 years to kind of get it to this stage. But what I do is I start a new book on the 1st of September when the kids go back to school, and I write that first draft until it's ready to be submitted to my publisher and agent up until kind of Easter. And then between Easter and summer, I do all of the edits, copy edits, line edits, etc. And then I take 2 months off every year. I take a month off in August so I can spend the month with the kids and do all that stuff, getting them ready for school and all and holidays. And I also take a month off around Christmas. I take kind of the middle of December to the middle of Jan off
Oh,
because I'm
that's
basically claus. I just love Christmas. But by doing that, I work hard and then equally then I kind of make sure that I have downtime too. So while I
yeah.
do work 7 days a week, a lot of the time I make sure I have time off then as well, which makes up
Yeah.
for it. So it works
Oh,
well.
that must really motivate you as well to know that you're going to have that lovely family time.
Yeah,
Mm. Yeah,
definitely.
100.
And I just kind of come off that really, because we had a lovely break over Christmas and I really felt like I had a break, you know what I mean? I felt like it sounds stupid, like, but my grandmother used to say, and she's passed now, but she used to say to me, "Your brain must be so tired," and sometimes your brain just does get tired because there's so much
Mhm.
going on as a writer. It's
Yeah.
like your computer sometimes gets overworked if you've too many tabs open. Well, that's what I feel like as a writer is that there's too many tabs in my brain open because I can sometimes be thinking about I'm thinking about the book I'm writing, the next book, which is kind of nudging me, saying, come on, get to me. The previous book, which I'm usually just about to start doing marketing and publicity for. And then other books which are maybe being translated into different languages. So you can have so many characters buzzing around your brain. So it
Yeah.
is nice at Christmas and in August just to kind of take a beat, to step away from them all and just think about myself and family. That's lovely.
Yeah, definitely.
It's very nice that you're able to do that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your latest book, The Stolen Child?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. Well, it's a thriller. It's been dubbed an emotive thriller by my publisher, and I think it is because all of my books are quite emotional reads. I've been tagged the queen of emotional fiction a few times, and people will say they have to get tissues out when they read my books, and I think that's because the characters become quite beloved. And if you love a character and something terrible happens to them, you tend to feel greater emotion, I think. But the story is set around the Murphy family in 1983, who go on a cruise around the Mediterranean, and they're sharing a small cabin. As if anyone listening has ever been on a cruise, you know what it's like. But they wake up one morning and their 2.5-year-old son has disappeared from their cabin overnight. And that starts over 40 years of devastation for them because Robert is never found. And then in the present day, Lily, his younger sister, who was only 6 months when he went missing from the cabin, and she's now a psychotherapist, and she takes on a new client, and he has a theory as to what happened to her brother. Somebody doesn't want the truth to get out though, so there's lots of twists and turns in this one, and it is, yeah, it's quite fast paced and quite emotional as well.
Yeah. How did you come up with the idea for that story?
Do you know that it was actually inspired by my son, by an almost terrifying moment that happened for us as a family? Thankfully, none of the things that happen in this book actually happened to my son, but it did trigger the story. We were on a family holiday in Orlando, in Florida, and on our first night there, in a one-bedroom kind of apartment in a hotel complex, and all fast asleep, I woke up at 3 in the morning and heard a kind of a banging on the front door of the apartment. And my husband said, don't answer it. We're in Florida, we're not in Wexford anymore. And he said, I'll ring reception. But I went to the front door and I can remember saying to Raj, my husband, that's Nate. And my son Nate was only 4 at the time, 4 or 5. And he said, don't be ridiculous. He's asleep in the bed beside us, because it was one bedroom and it were two double beds. So the kids were in one bed and Roger and I were in the other. And if I put my hand out, I could have touched him. He went into the bedroom to double check he was right. I opened the door, and sure enough, there was Nate in the corridor, and he was hysterical. And he had begun sleepwalking that night. And it was the first time we realized as a family. It became years of, I'm telling you, like nightmares for us for years. We had to booby trap every room we were ever in, and all the windows and the doors, to make sure he couldn't escape. But he had begun sleepwalking, and the poor darling, he had woken up when he heard the ding of the lift right at the end of a really, I don't know if you know Florida hotels, but they're massive. And he was at the end of a very long corridor, and he was so terrified. But luckily, he had remembered that I had said to him when we checked in and we went to our room, I said, oh, we'll never forget which is our room, because it's at the very end of this corridor. And he remembered that. And he said he ran as fast as he could. And then he didn't know whether it was the right or left door, but he guessed the left and it was correct. So we were terrified. I cried for the first week of that holiday. I also made sure that he slept with me every night after that. But then I began, the writer's mind started, and I started going to the what ifs. And what if he hadn't found his way back? What if someone had taken him? What if he'd had an accident, fallen into the pool? And that kind of began the story. And my husband then said, as we talked about this, and he said, Carmel, who would believe us if we'd woken up the next morning and he was gone? Nobody would believe us that as parents we'd slept through him disappearing from such a small space, like all in one room. No one would believe us. And they'd say we'd done something to him. And then I was going, oh my God. And then Roger said, and they would never believe you'd done anything, because he said, I kind of live with my heart in my face. I wouldn't be a poker player. And he said, everyone would know that you were so upset. But he said, like, Rog is more measured. And I said, oh yeah, you're in prison, Rog. You're God. Like it was, and that's what made me think about the story. So the story kind of came from that. I started noodling in it for years, actually, until I eventually decided to write it. But what I will
Wow.
say, there's no sleepwalking in this book. It's not about sleepwalking, just to confirm it's not about sleepwalking, but it did make the
Oh,
story come.
that's such a good story as well. And I just it's so lucky that he, like, the room that you were in was such a memorable room for him to come back to, and lucky that he picked the right door as well.
It was just terrifying. And it really was. And like he's done, like over the years, we've got so many funny stories of his sleepwalking, but we couldn't let him go to anyone's house for, other than his grandparents who would booby trap their doors because you just didn't know where he might end up. It was a real problem for us for a while, it really was.
Yeah. My youngest went through a phase of sleepwalking and it was terrifying. It's such a
Really is,
eerie thing.
Mary.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You
I couldn't
understand.
imagine.
So
Mm. Yeah, and then they're in a completely different world, aren't they? And he never actually woke up. I always managed to get him back into his bed, but it
yeah.
was like talking to a different child. It was really strange.
You're not supposed to
Well, we
wake
did
a
say
sleep,
Patricia,
right?
you're not.
No, I don't think
No,
so.
you're not. And they say that it typically starts at around the age of 4, and usually kind of goes by about 10. And most issues happen when they're not in their own environment. So by us being in a new hotel, it was his first time in a hotel. So it was kind of obviously was a stressful thing. And a lot of it is through that, which meant sleepovers were not a good idea for Nate because,
Oh,
he out of his environment. So yeah,
oh wow.
tricky.
Oh, wow. And like you've obviously mentioned, the book's got some really great twists in it. So how do you go about plotting a twist and creating that?
This book was a joy to write, but it was also difficult because there are 3 timelines in it. I do like to make things difficult for myself, but in order to tell this story, um, I really needed, I don't want to give anything away, but all of the motivations for the character, they had to be authentic and realistic. And I needed readers, um, as the story unfolds, to kind of go, okay, I might not have done that myself, but I understand why, and at least to kind of have empathy with it. And in order for that to happen, I had to really dig deep into the characters' backstories. And that's what brings me back to the 1960s in London. So I have 3 timelines: 1960s in London, an orphanage in London. There's a lot of poverty there. Then I have the 1980s when the actual child goes missing, for the Murphy family, and that's between Spain and Dublin. And then the present day brings you between Spain and Dublin again, as all of the answers begin to unfold. So keeping track of all of that was fun, and I use a software tool called Scrivener. I'm not sure, Scrivener. I'm sure some of your listeners will use it, and it takes a beat to get used to it, but it's worth it. It is the best investment I ever made, because what I do is, when I'm writing a story with different timelines, I write each part individually. Now I might flip from one to the other, but how I can set it up, I can set a folder up for the 1960s, a folder for the present day, a folder for the 1980s. And then I write all the chapters, and they're not going to be in that sequence when the story is finished. But it means I can keep track of things really, really. So that helps me with my plotting. And then the other thing I have to say is, I think if you're writing a book with a lot of twists like this, you have to edit, 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 and edit again, because as you reveal a twist, or as you reveal a new character backstory, you've got to go back over and over to make sure that the plot holds that up and that there are no holes. Because there's nothing more frustrating if you read a book, is there, and there's a question posed and it's never answered, and you're going, why was that said? There was a thread, and then we never really got to the bottom of that, and that makes a very unsatisfying read. So I didn't want that to happen. And what I was so pleased about, was that when I sent it in to my editor, now I have to tell you, ladies, I really worked hard on this book. But I remember her saying to me when she came back, and she rang me, and she said, I was making notes as I was reading it, kind of going, oh, what about this? And every single note I made, you answered further along in the book. And you were like, oh, that's why that's there. So I was really pleased, but it did take a lot of work. I don't think you can write a thriller unless you're prepared to put the work in. That if you're going to do twists like that, you have to make sure that you execute them well, I think. I hope
I
I
love
did anyway.
I really love books like yours where there's lots of different stories that all intermingle. And I've always wondered how an author can do that, how you can keep those stories together and which bit to put in at which point, to sort of tease the story along. I love that sort of timeline.
Yeah, it's really
And that's
clever.
difficult. No, sorry, I was going to say, just say on that, that's a tricky one because you don't want to bring a reader out of a timeline too quickly so that they kind of feel like, oh, I was just getting into that, or leave them there too long because then they don't want to go to another timeline. So you have to find that sweet spot whereby they're ready to get back. You want them always want to go back to the next story. And that's tricky. It takes a bit of, that's where a good editor comes in as well. They'll really help you with that.
Do you find it hard to come back to the real world when your writing's going well? Are you really immersed in that world?
Yeah, it is. That's a really good question, actually, because some of the scenes, if I'm writing difficult scenes, I actually leave home. I go home to write them because there is like, so okay, so I'm a mother, right, and family first to me every time, but if I ever write scenes that involves any trauma for a child, I can't write them at home, and I need to go. So I'll go to a hotel, or I'll go to I'll schedule. There's a writers retreat in Ireland called the Tyrone Guthrie Centre, and I always book a week there every year, and I write all the difficult scenes there because I'm staying in a self-catering lodge, and I can cry as I write. I can, put on sad music if I need to get a good boo-hoo out. But I will sometimes cry when I write because if those scenes are difficult, and I just can't do that and then switch back on into making lunches and what's for dinner, mom. You know what I mean? It's tricky. So I try to do those all in one go and get the hardship out of the way, and then write the more normal scenes then at home. But it can be tricky, and I think that's where having you've got to have a balance, a work-life balance. Like my dog actually is a help. I have he's like my little therapist. George Bailey, he's a rescue cockapoo, and he's the most loving. I don't think anybody loves me more than that dog does, to be honest with you. And he really helps me because he's with me the whole time. And sometimes I'll just go for a walk with him and out in the fresh air with him, and just, amongst, as I said, the trees. I love trees, and just being out and about, that helps me. But it does take a beat. And I don't tend to read a lot when I'm deep into writing a story because I find it too hard to read another book when I'm creating one. I do all my reading outside of that big creative time, but I'll do good Netflix or Prime stream, I'll find something and I'll just watch something and allow my mind to go to that.
How do you motivate yourself then when the words aren't quite flowing just how you want them to?
My top tip for anybody who feels that they are stuck is leave that scene and write a scene that you know that you want to write. Because we all have, when you plot a book, there's always big moments in the book that you're excited to get to. Don't wait to get to it. You know what I mean? Write out a sequence. And that's where Scrivener is really useful for me because I can write it and then I can just pull it and drag it to where it needs to be at the end. So I'll sometimes do that. So I'll write one of the big twists that I know is coming, and I'll write that because it's exciting to write it. And then I'll just leave it there unfinished. I have to go back to it, but it always kickstart me. So that's what I would do.
I suppose also going for a nice dog walk will motivate you as well, and get you
Totally.
back into the swing of things.
Yeah. And be kind to yourself. Like if it doesn't come, it doesn't come. We all have bad days. Like it doesn't matter what you do. Everybody has an off day, and you can do that. And there's always, like, I might actually, like, I really enjoy now. This is now the book geek in me. I am such a nerd, but I'll reorganize my bookshelves, and that quietens my mind, and I'll decide, will I do them by rainbow color, or will I do them by author or category? Because as well as my bookshelves that I have in my writing room, which are just my books, we have a floor to ceiling. We have call it the library, but it's a room that we've turned into a library, but it's got floor to ceiling bookshelves with a rolling ladder, and very much indulging my fantasy. But with that, like, I'll go in and I'll reorganize that. I really enjoy organizing that. I have all my favorite authors there, and at the minute I'm by category. At the minute, that's what I'm doing. I've kind of gone and but I changed I could change that next week. It just depends.
There's nothing better than an aesthetically pleasing library and bookshelf. I love it.
Yeah. And you want everybody to notice it, and then nobody notices it. I get so cross, but I want everyone to go in and worship at my work and go, oh, wow, that really makes a difference. That looks so good, Carmel, But yeah, I do love a good library sort.
And have you always wanted to be a writer?
I'd have been quite happy being a librarian actually as a kid too, because my favorite place to be was actually the library, which probably doesn't surprise you just based on what I just said. We didn't have a huge, like, I come from a very working class background. There wasn't a lot of money, and so there was no money to buy books. So the library was my haven, really. And I absolutely adored going to the library. And we would get penny sweets, right? You'd get a bag of penny sweets once a week. And I used to trade my penny sweets to my brother and sisters for one of their library cards, because you got 4 library cards a month, which meant 1 book a week. And I read far more than that. So I could end up with 8 books a month by giving away some of my penny sweets to my brothers and sisters. And that's what I did. That's so much. And I loved the library. And the only problem was, at the time, it's fabulous now, but I'm not old, but when I was young, there was only one shelf for children's books, or one section for children's books, and I got through it fairly quickly. So then I used to have to try to sneak past the librarian with older books. And I can actually still remember I remember being stopped because I was only about 10, and I'd taken out Tolkien's, the trilogy, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and it was like this, the tube, it's huge, it's this massive book. And the librarian said, "Oh, Carmel, like, I just think you're not ready for that." And I was like, "I am, I am, I am." And he let me go with it. And my God, I just loved it. It was just incredible. I'd never experienced anything like it. It was so different. But yeah, I think
How
libraries
old
are
were you? How old were you then?
10, I think. 10,
Oh
I'd say.
wow. That's
Yeah.
impressive.
It is. Well, I started to read by the time I went to school at 4, I was already reading. So books have always been, and I think somewhere in that library, when I used to go to the library every week, I'd have to beg my mother to bring me, because we live rurally, as I said, and it's a bit of there's no buses, there's no public transport where I live, so you'd have to get a lift into the library. But trying to get her to bring me into the library more than the once a month, which was kind of allotted. But somewhere along that time, I decided I wanted to be a writer too. So books have always been kind of my passion, have always been um, one of the greatest loves of my life, first as a reader, and then do you know, anyway, do you know, this is a true story now, which is going to tell you a little bit about Carmel Harrington as a young girl. My parents, a few years ago, did a big job on the house, and they peeled back years and years of wallpaper in the good sitting room. Don't know if you grew up with a good sitting room, but we had one whereby you were only allowed in it when, if the priest came to visit, he was to the good sitting room. Like, it was like for children were not allowed in it. So the wallpaper was peeled back, and there were 4 or 5 layers of wallpaper until it came to the lining. And on the lining, Mum had obviously said to us as kids that we could all scribble on the lining, before they put the paper up. And all of my scribbles in one section were me signing my signature. So practicing my autograph. And it was like, my name is, and I was an O'Grady before I was a Harrington. So it was Carmel O'Grady. And yeah, and it was literally rows and rows of me practicing my autograph, and it hasn't changed that much. It's Harrington now as opposed to O'Grady. But so I don't remember doing that, but obviously at that point I must have been thinking one day.
That's amazing.
It's funny. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so have you always been a writer then, or did you do something before you kind of got into that field?
No, I mean, I was quite, as well as being a bit geeky, I was very different to anyone else in my family. They were all very sporty, and I wasn't. And I lived in my imagination. And really, I was a child I was a teen in the 80s, and in my school, my secondary school, there was no outlet for me, and there was nobody like me, or at least publicly saying they were like me. So there were no clubs for writers, there were no reading groups. The library was a place that you went to study. There were no books. It's very different now. I was asked to be patron of my alma mater, and it's such a wonderful creative space now. And they really encourage creative writing and encourage all kind of academic persuasions, whereas back then it was all about, it was very different, and there was no real kind of career path or academic path for somebody like me. So I kind of learned to kind of keep my ambition secret, and I never told anybody. I really was very private about it, and I was quite shy, and I was unsure of myself. It took me a long time to get the nerve to actually say out loud that I wanted to be a writer. And I ended up just getting into another career. I worked in Aer Lingus, our national airline in Ireland, and I worked there for 10 years, and I traveled the world with them. And then I moved into the private sector, and I ended up in a sales and marketing role. Like, I was a business development manager for an American multinational. So my career just kind of happened, and I was successful and I did well. And all the time I was writing short stories, and eventually I had written 2 novels, and I showed nobody. Like, it was ridiculous. I just found it really, I was stuck. I was in my own way, and I found it really difficult to say the truth of who I was. And I suppose there was a fear of failure and also a fear of judgment, and people might think you might have notions about yourself. So I just kind of kept it to myself. And it was only when I got married, or when I met my husband, which was a little bit late, like I was late to the party. I was 35 when I met my husband, and I confessed to him, and he was really the first person that I kind of really said, one day I want to be a writer, and I've written a book. And he never let me let go of that dream. He encouraged me. And then when my daughter was born, I was 40, and it was a real milestone moment for me, because um, I was very, very happy personally. I had, you know, met met the love of my life, and we'd started a family, and so happy, blissfully happy. I can't express how happy I was. I felt like my life was charmed. But then I thought about my career, and I was like, okay, I've done okay, but I'm not happy. I don't really love what I do. And I remember thinking, am I living my best life? No, almost, but not quite. And I decided to kind of go for it. And I got brave. Um, and thankfully, it happened quite quickly after that. I was published and got a deal with HarperCollins, and here we are, 13 books later. So it
What
worked
was
out.
your route to publication?
Um, well, when I decided that, I had that kind of moment where I went, "Oh, I'm going to go for it." We were in a recession, and nobody was publishing books. Like, literally nobody was publishing books. And I remember reading an article in, I think it was the Irish Examiner, anyhow, and an editor who I ended up working with at some point in the future. But she was being interviewed, and she said, "If I buy one book this year, that's it. You know, we're not buying books, we're concentrating on the backlist." And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, now this, I picked a fine time to get brave. And then at the same time, then I had heard about an author who doesn't write in the same genre as me, but E.L. James was having huge success with her 50 Shades, you know, her romance books. And I thought, okay, so I decided to self-publish my first book as an ebook only. And the only reason I did that, this was back in 2012, and nobody was really self-publishing. Nobody knew anything about it. And in Ireland, nobody even had e-readers. Like, it was very different. But I thought, if I did that, maybe I'd have a story that might get me a yes from an agent, because I'd had 47, I always remember the number, 47 no's from agents. And I was like, okay, I need something to get me noticed. And that book, that first book, went to #1 on Amazon, and it did get me noticed, and it got me an agent, and it got me a book deal with HarperCollins, who republished it like very quickly. So it was only for sale actually for about a couple of months, self-published, ebook only, and then it came down, and then a few months later it was back up again under HarperCollins kind of umbrella. So that worked for me. But I don't really know much about self-publishing, because I was there for such a short time, but it really helped me get noticed. It gave me a conversation starter, I think, that made an agent then say, oh, maybe it's worth giving her a chance. So that's how I kind of got into it.
I love that, because it's not a direct route. You know, it's
No,
gone different ways. So that's really good. I wanted to
that's
ask
my
you
life though.
about,
Honestly,
yeah,
Mary, everything in my life, whether it's personally or professionally, I do like to take the long way to get there, you know, honest to goodness. One of these days I'll go directly to Go, and I'll get the 200 quid. But for me, I end up in I end up in everywhere along the way, you know what I mean? So
absolutely do. Yeah.
community, anyone? Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening to the first ever episode of The Write Club. We've loved having you, and we can't wait to welcome you back next week for part 2 of this episode, where Carmel will be giving us an insight as to what's next for her as a writer. Stay tuned.